131. All right. Welcome aboard, everyone. Today is our last one for this series, and it's Harry Truman, which is a good subject. Um, and if you've been watching television or you haven't been you haven't been somewhere that you didn't have any access to media, well, you know that there's at least on the table I don't know, I guess some sort of negotiation for the hostages over in Gaza, right, between Hamas and Israel to be released. So I bring that up only because we're at the beginning of that thread, which is Harry Truman, and we'll be talking about at least the United States's um, acknowledgement of the government of State of Israel. And we were the first government to do it. So that certainly has been, probably more than any other thread, that has just been a continuous thread. I mean, I can't remember a time. I just in December 30th, I turned 67 years old, and I can't remember a time where there wasn't Israel, fighting or having to fight or to defend its borders, et cetera. It's something that literally has spanned my entire lifetime. I assume yours as well. And so thank you for joining me today. Um, and I'm going to talk about Harry Truman, as I said. Let me go to my screen share and bring up my PowerPoint. Here we go. You can all see Harry Truman. Good picture, right? By the way, in case you weren't ever thinking about running for president, you get a presidential portrait in case that's a motivator for you to want to do something like that. Harry Truman actually looks pretty good here. You know, he's always a pretty good dresser. You may have heard that he actually owned a clothing store at one point that went bankrupt. And so Harry Truman, the reason I like this one is because it talks about an important period of history spanning the 20th century. Because Harry Truman himself was a veteran of World War One, combat veteran of World War One, and thus making him the only combat veteran of World War One who served as president. Sometimes people they say, well, what about Dwight David Eisenhower? He was in the army during World War One. But the distinction is being during World War One, Ike didn't actually serve as part of the Allied Expeditionary Force in Europe. He never left the States, right? Not that that's a slam on him. If we were doing a program on Eisenhower, I would tell you how the generals over in the European theater during World War II, they kind of looked down on Eisenhower because they were like, well, why is this guy in charge? He was never in combat. He wasn't even in World War II. You say, so why is he in charge of all of us who are veterans of World War One? See, and World War One is the seminal event that changed the world forever. It was really the point where the old world was over and the new world had begun, the world that we live in today. And remember, I did a program yesterday on Neville Chamberlain, and I was trying to express to my audience, we have to consider that all of the people who were adults during this era, right? Like, say, for instance, I don't know, the beginning of World War II, 1939, 1940. Those people clearly remembered, all of them, whether they were Americans or British or French or Germans. They clearly remembered World War One. World War One was the events that were driving them in World War II, whether they were trying to avoid it or to avenge it or to stay out of it. You cannot underestimate the influence of World War One in everything. Certainly, the Middle East, as I mentioned or alluded to just a moment ago, the Middle East was created at the result of the Treaty of Versailles. We're creating what appear to be intractable differences between the Islamic world and the Western world, right? After all, the entire map of the Middle East, or most of it, was changed as a result of victorious powers after World War One, without even really consulting anybody. You see, so that is why it smacks of dominance in what today we would call colonialism. So, so Harry Truman, what do we know about him? We see him in the context of somebody else, really. And that somebody else, of course, is Franklin Delano Roosevelt, right? And that is it. This is one of these situations where, Harry Truman is obviously is president, but when he became president, it was just, well, FDR, he died. So, we're stuck with this guy, and we'll get rid of him as soon as the next election is comes along, right? People had a very low approval rating of Harry Truman when he left office. And another interesting point about that might be illustrative of other presidents, is I don't know, the wisdom or the changing perceptions in our hindsight of these things, right? And in other words, you look back 30 years, you look back 40 years, and you say, was this guy really so bad? Now that the now that the blindness of the present has passed, you see. And Harry Truman's approval ratings have steadily gone up in the eyes of historians, etc. He's never going to be as popular as Abraham Lincoln or something like that, right? And but he was in the shadow of Franklin Delano Roosevelt his entire presidential career, obviously. So we'll get into it. This hour and a half, as always, is going to go fast. I'm looking forward to doing this with you. All right. So Harry Truman is another one of our presidents. There's a clique of presidents that is not part of the pedigree, right? I've already done a couple of them in our programs today, and that's something that I like to do. I want to talk about people who didn't fit the mold, and generally speaking, were rejected by what we would call today establishment Washington, right? Um, and well, he was born in Missouri, right? Which even in 1884 was still, I mean, you had St. Louis and all the rest of that, but remember that the power brokers in our country and politics were really from the East. Not exclusively, but mostly. Certainly the tradition of it, the assumptions of it, the pedigree of it. And I did a program yesterday on Eleanor Roosevelt, talking about the pedigree of the Roosevelt family, which of course not just included Eleanor, even though she wasn't pretentious or anything else like that. That's another story for another day. But the family of Franklin Roosevelt, Eleanor's fifth cousin once removed. They grew up with a silver spoon and a level of privilege and a level of the proper education, of the level of the proper upbringing in society and background and opportunities. Um, Harry Truman was not that. Harry Truman was, as you can see here, we start off in May 8th, 1884, born in Lamar, Missouri, and he farmed. right? So here's another person who started off like, I guess, Abraham Lincoln as a farmer, right? Not because that was his aspiration, I think. You might ask yourself, I don't know, does that have an impact on a person? I think it has an impact on a person. I look at my own life. Um, I'm only comparing myself only up to that very minuscule point that your childhood experiences have an effect on you. I grew up in a blue collar environment with people who just worked with tools and equipment and smelled a little bit like oil, and I don't know. I think that I look back on that despite the personalities of some of the people I'm referring to, I look at it with a deep kind of affection and respect. And I would say the same thing about somebody who was planting or hoeing a field or riding a tractor, right? And but you see my point. So anyway, 1917 to 1919. So Harry becomes Captain Harry, right? Captain of an artillery battery, right? When you're in charge of something that's yours, you're the captain of it, right? If the Coast Guard gave me a rowboat, I was the captain of the rowboat, right? And it was for you could call me captain, not that that ever happened. So he was a captain of this artillery battle, and he saw like combat, real combat. And so he brought that experience with him later on in his life, of course. Okay, so here's a famous one, right? 1919 to 1922, Kansas City, Missouri. Excuse me, I might cough here and there. I got this thing that won't seem to go away. Another good thing about a Zoom presentation, right? So a clothing store, right, which was always referred to as a haberdashery, which I don't even know what that word means. I'm sure it means something, right? Maybe it means in Latin, it means, ties and socks. I don't know. But the haberdashery, and it went out of business, right? It closed up. And that was something that people who were critics of Harry Truman used to mock him for the rest of his career. Okay, of course, because it's politics, and there's a lot of slander that goes on in politics and a lot of character assassination in politics. And Harry Truman's a Democrat, but people used to mock him constantly for that. Um, so he then actually goes into politics, right? He runs for office. And this is county judge of Jackson County, Missouri, right? Presiding judge of Jackson County, right? 1927 and 1934. And finally, 1935 to 45, United States Senator for Missouri. And these are consequential things, not in their own right. I mean, I'm sure they are, but I don't want to focus on that. What I do want to focus on is how Harry Truman actually got supported financially and with a little bit of muscle behind it. And I don't mean physical muscle. I mean, I meant that figuratively. Uh, there was this I don't know. Imagine something like Tammany Hall out in the Midwest, right? And it was called the Pendergast machine, right? Tom Pendergast wrote it. So it's synonymous with vice and corruption and, you do the right thing for me. It's like watching an episode of The Sopranos, I guess. And Tom Pendergast supports Harry Truman. So for this is important. This is the reason I'm taking the time for this. This follows Harry Truman, like the damn hat store, except worse. All right. It is like, why should we even take you, Mr. Truman, the honorable senator from Missouri, even seriously, everybody knows that you're owned and operated by Tom Pendergast. So therefore, we shouldn't even bother talking to you. You see? And that was a big backdrop in the political career of Harry Truman. So the question is, was he corrupt? Right? I mean, does being backed by Tom Pendergast mean that if the opportunity came hypothetically, that Harry Truman would have done corrupt things for Tom Pendergast, as our conversation would be implying? I don't know. Either it never came up and Harry Truman didn't have to do it, or it did come up and Harry Truman didn't do it. But anyway, there's no evidence to suggest that Harry Truman was nothing less than a pretty decent guy, you see. But if, like for instance, if you're watching the hearings today about, the Senate confirmations, et cetera, I mean, there's plenty of allegations about like, look, we all know that you must be corrupt or you're going to do something for somebody who is corrupt. Right? So don't tell us that you're going to be different than anybody else. This is just the way Washington is, and maybe that's the way common sense is, depending on your point of view. I'll leave you to figure that out. But anyway, that is a backdrop for Harry Truman, and it was a very strong one. He actually was, as a senator in World War II. Now you can see the time now is 1935 to 1945. That's a long run as a senator. And during the war, Harry Truman is put in charge of this committee of government expenditure waste. There was a tremendous amount of government expenditure in World War II, you might imagine. I mean, the government was handing out contracts to build everything, everything to everybody. And there was a lot of people, as you might imagine, well, that were less honest than other people. There's Harry Truman, who was good finding, contracts that were signed, money that was given to do something, and there was no, apparently it was a black hole, and all of the money disappeared or there was corruption, right? And Harry Truman did a very good job at that. He actually fleshed out a lot of, nefarious individuals who were just taking advantage of the fact that there was a lot of money to be handed out like candy on Halloween. Uh, Interesting point about that era of Harry Truman's career is he ran into something called the Manhattan Project, where apparently there was like tens of millions of dollars being constantly funneled in. And he just could not break through, right? Harry Truman had no idea what that was. It was just another, he didn't know what it was. And he could never find out what all that money was being spent on. And then Roosevelt, um, running for office for his fourth term, chooses Harry Truman to be his vice president. So why was Harry Truman chosen? I'm not sure, actually. I mean, the first answer I come to is FDR was such a large personality. He was such a large personality. He was such an entity that if you were FDR and you were choosing a vice president, what would you want? Somebody who was going to steal the spotlight from you? Right? Now, I don't want to sound too cynical about it, but that's, it's realistic terms that we've got here. I mean, really, the vice president, especially then, or maybe still, I'm not sure, I'll let you decide, is a position where you're sitting there by the phone waiting for something tragic to happen. I mean, ostensibly, it's like, well, this person's in charge of this, and they're going to do that, and they're going to do this. And, sometimes they do it and sometimes they don't. But really, the vice presidency, certainly in this case, Harry Truman had FDR not died and survived World War II, and then until the next election, somebody else got elected. Harry Truman, we wouldn't even be talking about him. You see? So, and then of course, Franklin Delano Roosevelt does pass away on April 12th, 1945, and Harry Truman becomes president. And people are like, are you kidding me? Harry Truman's the president now? That Harry Truman? The senator from Pendergast, Harry Truman, which is what they called him derisively, by the way. It wasn't the honorable senator from Missouri. He was the senator from Pendergast, right? And it was the guy who couldn't even run a hat store in Missouri is now running the country in the most decisive time in the history of the United States, right? Where we're facing the beginning of the Cold War and the end of the European War and the Japanese-American War in the Pacific was. Who knows how long that's going to take? You see, that was the context of Harry Truman and most people's introduction to Harry Truman. So Harry Truman dies in 1972. It's a pretty good run, actually. 1972, 82, 92. That's pretty good. Died in Kansas City, Missouri, age 88. Excuse me. All right. Now this is a little bit of trivia. Do we want trivia? Give him hell, Harry. Okay. He liked his boat. Famous quote was the buck stops here, right? You saw President Biden use that in the early part of his presidency. I'm the president and the buck stops here, right? So that is the go-to thing to say that accountability is going to reign under my leadership, right? That Harry Truman was known for this, and it was no BS. You come in here, I'm going to ask you questions. You better have the answers. Don't BS me. The buck stops here, right? There's a good picture of Harry Truman, don't you think? I like that picture. He's always a snappy dresser, wasn't he? I mean, not to say that he went and he dressed himself in this, probably not, but you see he has his little spectacles on, of course. Good shot. I gotta get me one of them hats, man. That's a good hat. Harry Truman. So Harry Truman meets his love of his life back in grade school, right? All throughout school. I mean, I guess in those towns back in those days, I'm making the assumption, which isn't a ridiculous assumption, that probably everybody knew each other, right? How many people were living in a rural town and with houses, where remember everyone was walking around on their smartphone. He fell in love with, of course, Bess, right? And he wrote her letters and he courted her. And, Bess's mother didn't really like Harry, right? And Bess's family, I forgot their actual name, Bess's family, where they considered themselves the elite of that particular town in Missouri. And Harry seemed like a commoner to Bess's mother, right? Another famous story, of course, was that when we were talking about Harry Truman being in the haberdashery, right? Who was his partner? His partner was a Jewish guy whose name escapes me. And Harry wanted to bring the guy home for dinner. After all, they were partners, but he couldn't come back to Harry's house because Bess didn't want him in the house because he was Jewish. Now, I mean, from our standpoint today, we're like, oh my God, that's blatant anti-Semitism, which obviously it is. But the point is that back in those days, not that I'm making an excuse for it, I mean, how uncommon was that, you see? Um, so anyway, there's Harry. Nice shot, Harry. Here's Harry in his wearing his lieutenant bar, right? And there, of course, he's already married. You can see the wedding ring on his finger. He's shipped out and serving his country abroad in the Great War. There's another picture. Any of you have pictures like this of your relatives? I got two of them. I got one of my mother's father, right? And he wearing a doughboy outfit, right? It was same helmet. As a matter of fact, I got the helmet, both helmets downstairs. And and my wife's grandfather, right? And they're both. I think that the pictures was taken all in the same studio. It was the exact same background. And what the hell is kind of cool, you know? They weren't officers, either one of them. They were just, doughboys. There he is, Captain Harry. This helmet that the Americans adopted till the beginning of World War II was a British design, right? And the helmet it was called a trench helmet. And World War One left us with another things like this, the trench coat and all sorts of other things. But the helmet was designed almost like a little umbrella, you see. You were the Germans as well as ourselves, or I mean, I should say the British and the French and the Americans. They would lob high caliber shells, howitzer shells, cannon shells next to the trenches of your opponent. And what that would do is it would send a tremendous volume of debris airborne. And when gravity stopped it from going airborne and it came back down to Earth, the people in the trenches were showered, and I mean showered, with all manner of things that you don't want hitting your skull, right? You might imagine the amount of tree roots and rocks and God knows what, right? And I'm sure because it was a war zone, there was parts of bodies, et cetera, coming down in that too, because unrecovered bodies who just got blown to smithereens are going to be landing in parts on your head in that trench. So that's why that helmet was shaped like that. You see, World War One doesn't get the attention it really deserves as far as how it shaped the 20th century. I know this picture is a little fuzzy, but there's Harry in the hat store, the haberdashery, by the way. There it is. You see the ties hanging from the overhead? Right. It reminds me of they had these delis where I grew up. They were like Italian delis, and they always had these meats hanging from I don't know, these chrome hooks, actually. That's what that reminds me of. So you remember political pins? Yeah, here's political pin. Truman for senator. A winner for the New Deal. Now, this is branding. You see, the Roosevelt administration I mean, they invented an entire strata of politics and political advertising that exists right to the present moment. And there's the Roosevelt administration that really, I talked about this a little bit when we did Hoover, but the Roosevelt administration capitalized on messaging. right? Right. We still hear that, of course, all the time today. Well, we didn't get our message across, or their message was told better than our message. The message, the message, the message. So you had people still were in reading print newspapers mostly, okay, but you had radios, right? Probably this was the era of that people had radios, those big old, wooden radios, Philco and all the rest of that stuff, Zenith. And it was the New Deal. The New Deal. So if you wanted to be somebody who was going to be a popular, I don't know, candidate, I mean, this guy isn't, Harry S. Truman is not vying to be the vice president. He never even considered such a thing, right? But you want to appeal to Democrats. You want to appeal to something that's popular in that in your party, and that was the New Deal. That was the question. Are you a New Deal person or are you not a New Deal person? Right? And he's putting it right up front, right? That was sort of like, are you, do you want to make America great again or something like that? Right? And it's a branding, it's a logo, it's an identification that you look at immediately. This is very, very important in moving societies, in moving public opinion, in peripheral thought. Do you realize how many things you and I actually are influenced by that we don't even register consciously on a daily basis? Right? So a winner for the New Deal, Harry S. Truman, right? Independence, Missouri. Make him the Democratic nominee for the United States Senate. I love this picture. Isn't that a good picture? It's just a perfect picture, right? Because, like, all right, so he's a politician, but how do you not trust somebody who's making his own damned toast? You see what we've got here? Now, I'll leave it to you to decide if Harry Truman is just like staged this photograph or if this is like what they really look like, him and the little missus in the kitchen. You see, and she's there, and God knows she's, I don't know, scrambling eggs or whatever she's doing. An unusual smile on Bess's face. I don't mean to knock Bess, but she's not known for her big grins. And I don't know, I like the picture anyway. It's just a good picture. Harry Truman looked good in pictures, you know? All right, so register and vote Democratic. Right. Don't ask me what the rooster's for in the banner on the top. I don't know. And so it's Harry Truman is going to be FDR's vice president for the fourth consecutive term, right? Now, remember, we've already been through the Great Depression. We've already been through, I mean, World War II has been raging since 1939. It's the single biggest, most traumatic conflagration the world has ever seen, right? And Franklin Delano Roosevelt has been in power since 1933. It seems to me that the vice president was practically inconsequential until it wasn't. This was another political pin, Roosevelt and Truman, right? There's somebody was selling this on eBay. So I didn't want the damn pin. I just stole the picture. You can see it's on like a Formica countertop or whatever that stuff is. The swearing in for the fourth time is like, it's a little perfunctory at this point. Um, there's Harry. You see him in the back on the right side? He's wearing that cool hat. Is that like a Stetson hat? I think it's a Stetson hat. Looks good, right? And Franklin Delano Roosevelt, speaking of looking good, I don't think that FDR looks good, right? Because he's not a well man. So what's Harry Truman's job as vice president, right? It's not like he ever found out what the Manhattan Project was about. He still didn't know, right? So the vice president, he's going around and he's going to make himself seem useful. Here he happens to be in the Washington canteen, right? For service people, you can come in as long as you're wearing your uniform. You got to, I don't know, talk to celebrities or movie stars, celebrity, and get served a piece of cake by Betty Davis or something like that. And here he is playing the piano, which is the skill of Harry Truman's. And he's playing the Missouri Waltz, right? Very prideful from his state, by the way. And there, of course, is the resplendent Lauren Bacall. Now, what does Lauren Bacall need to do to entertain the troops? Nothing. Just be Lauren Bacall, you know? I got to hand it to old Harry here. It just reminds me of this photograph. I mean, you know, I mean, I've been a good husband, but it is, I'm not a perfect person. But if I was sitting there playing the piano, I think I would probably forget what I was playing under these circumstances. I mean, she's quite attractive. And the thing is that Harry Truman, he was never in a sexual scandal or anything like that. I mean, this guy had an eye for Bess, and he loved her unequivocally. And there was no wavering, there was no distraction, there was no nothing. And good for him, And he was also a Christian man. He was what we would refer to as today as, I guess, as an evangelical, right? So you've got somebody who is really, he's walking the walk, right? He is somebody who believes in scripture. So that probably helped him with his not being distracted. Who the hell knows what was going on in his mind, right? But um it's a good picture. All right. This is a staged photograph, right? Not to say that it didn't happen. Of course it happened. There they are, but the thing is that are these two really sitting down as it would imply and like they do every Wednesday morning having breakfast? No, you can see that, the napkins aren't even opened or anything else like that. These two practically, I wouldn't say that they didn't talk, but they didn't talk. And Harry Truman, he had no idea what the negotiations were between the big three, where there had already been a number of meetings between Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Churchill and Stalin and everything else like that. Harry had really no inkling whatsoever about what the post-World War II plans were going to be, or how things were going to be administered, or how you were going to deal with the communists, or certainly not what was something called the Manhattan Project and the atomic bombs, right? Harry Truman had no idea. He wasn't even near the top of the list of to the people who were going to be in the know about many of those things. You see, take a good look at Franklin Delano Roosevelt here. This is like it's either February or March of 1945. I was supposed to label the shot and I forgot to do it. See, there he is. Remember, Roosevelt dies on April 12th, 1945, down in Warm Springs, Georgia, right? And that was supposed to be these healing mineral baths, I guess. So I don't know. And what do you got to lose, I suppose? And he was down there, by the way, he wasn't down there alone. He was down there with his wife, Eleanor, was distressed to find out that he was with Lucy Mercer. If you want to know who that is, give it a quick Google. I don't want to spend the time talking about it. It was the same person who essentially wrecked his marriage to begin with, Eleanor Roosevelt's personal secretary. Okay. He was supposed to have dumped her. Right. Take a look at Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1933. It's quite the difference, isn't it, when you look at the slides side by side? Now, the guy had been through what? The whole country had been through the Great Depression um and then of course World War II. I would say that was a couple of things that would probably put a couple of gray hairs on a person's head, wouldn't you? But he had polio and I don't know what else. And in my lifetime, I'm happy to say I don't know the effects of polio on a person. But he's dead, April 12th, 1945. For many people, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was I mean, he was the only president that they ever had. And it's a long run. It's 12 years. So he was like a benevolent uncle practically. And remember, a lot of times people sat in their living rooms listening to President Roosevelt speak on his fireside chats. I mean, it's very personal. It was very personal. He had a gift to be able to use that medium and media in general to his advantage. Excuse me for a second, please. And people felt like they had lost a family member. You see, so I take the time to talk about this to this level because Harry Truman is in the context of this. He's nowhere near coming into his own right as his own politician, right? He is only seen in comparison to this swearing in of the vice president. It was best, of course. If I'm not mistaken, and I could be mistaken, but if I'm not mistaken, that is the Lincoln Bible, right? There's Forrestal right over there. He used to kill himself later on, by the way. Secretary of the Navy. It's another story for another day. It's a good picture, right? Despite the circumstances. And there's Margaret. There's Margaret. He did love his family. Famous story, you've probably heard it. Another one that should be put in context as far as what we perceive our ethics to be today, and what's appropriate and what isn't appropriate and that kind of stuff, is Harry Truman. I don't know what his daughter was. I don't know, a singer, I think it was. It was a singer or pianist. I don't know why I can never remember that. It doesn't matter. She's has her big debut, right? And she goes and she performs Margaret, and one of the reviewers really pans her. And Harry Truman wastes no time in responding. And he sends the guy a letter. Well, it was more of a note on presidential letterhead, right? President of the United States, the White House, Washington, D.C. And basically saying if he ever runs into the guy, he's going to kick his ass. Okay. And it is just boom, here you go. Um, so I talk about this because there's something about that is either disgusting to you or appalling to you or endearing to you. And it's part of human nature, and you either understand that or you don't. And if you don't think it matters, please review the 2024 election. Okay. And Harry Truman didn't care. He didn't care if it was on president, office of the President of the United States. And there you have it. Bess, by the way, absolutely despised Washington, D.C. She hated it. She hated the East Coast pretentiousness. She hated the pomp and the circumstance, not in the John Philip Sousa sense, but in the establishment, what you're supposed to do in society for as a woman sense. And don't forget, look who Bess Truman is replacing as the first lady, right? I mean, you want to talk about comparisons. Eleanor Roosevelt was everywhere. She was holding press conferences. She had meetings where, she had journalists in the White House. She was doing this, she was doing that. She was a social activist, right? She was um, an inspiration for social justice and all sorts of causes. Bess just wanted to go back to Missouri. She just wanted to go back to Missouri. So now Harry's president, and he spends 20 hours a day reading stacks of papers, trying to catch up to what's going on. So now he's got general after person after person after bureaucrat, handing him another stack of papers. You got to read this. You got to read this. This is what's going on. That's what's going on. And there is now Churchill, right? And this is in Europe, of course, circa Potsdam. The war in Europe is virtually completed, right? And Harry Truman is there, and he's the new leader. He's the new leader. And it wasn't like he was there before and people already knew him. He's got to come up to speed, and people are kind of sizing him up. Churchill is somebody you didn't really have to worry about that much. He was a solid ally. I mean, with other caveats, right? And Churchill by himself right now is about to get the boot. You see, British kept him on in a kind of like a coalition parliament for the war, right? And then as soon as obviously the war was over, certainly in Europe, then it was as Churchill put it, they gave me the royal boot, right? And they replaced him with Clement Attlee, which was from the Labour Party. And so, in other words, Great Britain now is going to change its complete position. We're already in the post-World War, right here. And Great Britain was now going to, for the first time, step aside and allow the United States, which is emerging from World War II, is really the first true global superpower, replete with nuclear weapons, nevertheless. And Great Britain is going to be a second-tier power. That wasn't easy for them to take, so they decided, you remember Great Britain had lost two generations of people in 2 generations. They were spent emotionally, physically, financially, and they were going to let the burgeoned United States of America protect the Western world at this point. And they're going to turn inward and create a national health network and everything else like that. That's what Clement Attlee was for. And that looks like Marshall. That looks like King. There's Harry Truman looking snappy in his well-tailored, double-breasted suit. And there is the man of the hour, Joseph Stalin. Now, here's where it gets interesting. right? Joseph Stalin is looking at Harry Truman, and Joseph Stalin, he's very poker faced. He would let you do the talking, and then he would use everything you said against you, right? And everybody's already on the next page. Everybody's already posturing for power in Europe and in the Far East. And so this is the Potsdam Conference, and really what this is about is what are we going to do with post-war Germany? Because you can't exactly just let Germany run itself because you have to purge the Nazis first, right? That's what people were getting into trouble. I mean, even somebody like Patton was like, look, the only people who know how to run this city are the Nazis, right? And we'll keep an eye on them and make sure they're not doing anything Nazi-ish, but it was from a matter of principle, you couldn't keep the Nazis there. So you had to purge everybody, which means that there was a vacuum of government leadership as the Germans were concerned. And so that means that you had to have occupation zones in Germany where the Allies were going to take over the country temporarily until the Germans could put themselves back together, right? And then everybody was supposed to leave. And what we were to find out pretty quickly was that Stalin never had any intention of leaving anything. Everywhere he went that was in the cause of winning World War II, Stalin very, very strategically mopped up as much territory as possible under the auspices of needing to win the war or defeat the Germans, but really it was to acquire land that now that you were there, you ain't giving back. You see, and those buffer countries were going to now become, you were going to put puppet dictators in, or I don't know, sympathetic governments. Let's put it that way. And then they were going to say, hey, you know what? We want to be a communist country. And that's how you wind up with all of those countries behind the Iron Curtain. And that's Harry Truman has no idea this at this point. I'm not sure. It's an interesting question. It could be an entire presentation about to what degree Stalin thought that he had duped Roosevelt in this kind of a category. Okay. Um, but Harry Truman, remember Harry Truman, the American people looked down on Harry Truman, right? What do you think Stalin thought of him? They're like, we are going to roll over this guy. Harry Truman is not even going to know what happened. You see, this hayseed from the Midwest, right, who was riding a tractor when he was a kid. We are going to plow over this guy, no pun intended, I'm sorry. And it reminded me of like when Eisenhower passed the torch over to Kennedy, right? Somebody like Stalin, he looked at Eisenhower. I mean, you can't not respect Eisenhower, right? And of course, by the time Eisenhower came in, right, it wasn't Stalin anymore. It was Khrushchev, But the point here is that Eisenhower was somebody you had to respect. The guy was like, five-star general, and he ran all of the Allied forces except for the Russians during World War II. Is a formidable character, right? But when Kennedy came in, Khrushchev looked at him and it was like, you're just a rich kid who's just used to having the Secret Service bring you young girls. What do you know? You never had to work for anything. You never had a test. You obviously have poor moral character and all the rest of that, right? Now, with the exception of the poor moral character, Stalin looked at Harry Truman and said, you have no experience. You have no experience. You don't know what's going on. We are going to crush you after the war is over. So there's Clement Attlee, who has already replaced Churchill now. That is Stalin. Now, this is in July 1945, right? So the war in Europe, right? VE Day is officially May 8th, right? One general surrendered on the 7th and one surrendered on the 9th. And so they just split the two and they called VE Day May 8th. So, this is something to celebrate. The war's not over though, right? So at this particular meeting, there's a messenger that comes over to Harry Truman and in this cryptic code language says that the baby's been born successfully, right? Which means that, well, the atomic bomb that was tested in the Alamogordo, New Mexico desert, well, the thing actually ignited and blew up, right? And wow, there's a game changer. And Harry Truman now, he is trying to be a good ally. And he says to Stalin, he says, by the way, we have this new weapon that's capable of flattening a city. And Stalin looks at him and he says, "Oh, well, congratulations on your new weapon, and we wish you the best of luck with it." That sort of a thing. Of course, the irony is that Stalin knew about our atomic bomb program before Harry Truman knew about it, right? So, I mean, it wouldn't take very long, for Soviet Union to get their own atomic bomb, and I'll be darned if their atomic bomb didn't look exactly like our atomic bomb, right? If you catch the drift, they had a lot of spies in the program, right? There is Harry Truman now telling the press that the Japanese have accepted the terms of the Potsdam Declaration, right? Now, the Potsdam Declaration, given during the time of the previous slide, was that Harry Truman had said, quote unquote, if Japan doesn't surrender, we will bring a rain of ruin from the air, the likes of which has never been seen, right? Which was true. And so the rest of those 3 months, well, the first thing that happened was right after the second dropping of the atomic bomb, by the way, on August 9th, 1945, the Russians declared war on the Japanese. Right? So the war is virtually over, but there you go. You have the Russians declaring war on the Japanese. So now the Russians, freed from the war in Europe, can come through, you know, China and actually go into, take territory, filling the vacuum of where the Japanese army was. And so the United States saw this as another land grab on part of Stalin, you see. And that was something that was going to fall directly on Harry Truman's plate as far as what to do about it. Um, so the Potsdam Declaration had one caveat. It really wasn't unconditional surrender. There was one exception that we actually made in this surrender of the Japanese. And that was that the emperor could be retained by the Japanese, at least in a, I don't know, in a ceremonial fashion, you see. And really the person who was going to be running Japan from 1945 to 1950 was one General Douglas MacArthur, you see. Um, so this went through Swiss channels behind the scenes, and the Japanese, we agreed to that Japanese request or demand or whatever it was, but here is Harry Truman after the dropping of the second atomic bomb, August 6th and August 9th, respectively, saying that the Japan has accepted the terms of the Potsdam Declaration. In other words, victory over Japan and the World War II now is over. The actual surrender documentation occurred in Tokyo Bay on September 2nd, 1945. Right. And so here is President Truman wipes out segregation in the armed forces. I know that this is a lousy photograph. It really just to remind me to tell you that, here's something he did by executive order. And what was this like 19, it was either 47 or 48, I forgot. But that was a pretty big deal. I mean, because remember in our country, it was kind of like what I was alluding to before about anti-Semitism. It's one thing having an emergency and having to have black people, I don't know, be in positions of power or at least positions of authority, if not power, and flying airplanes and that sort of stuff. But hell, the war is over, you see? And now there was going to be this like reckoning of did the world really change or was just that just an expedient that one could rationalize, you know? And not far behind that, by the way, was women working in industry. And women working in industry were like, okay, well, do your patriotic duty and, stand up for your brother, your father, your uncle, your boyfriend, your husband who is in a foxhole someplace, and run this machine, you say, make bombs and bullets or whatever else it is, Rosie the Riveter, right? And then when the war ended, it was a retooling effort, right? So manufacturers said, okay, well, everybody's got to kind of like go home because we're going to replace the dies that are needed to build tank parts. And now we're going to go back to building either cars or we're going to go back to building washing machines or we're going to start building washing machines. You get the picture, right? And then when women wanted to come back and say, hey, remember me? You told me I was your number one welder, and they would say, well, you know what? You were our number one welder, but we don't need you anymore. You're right. You did your patriotic duty. And now we want you to do the patriotic duty that you need to do now that your husband is coming home and wants to work in the factory. Don't take his job away. Go home, knock out some kids, right? That's your patriotic duty now. You see? So this business of desegregating the armed forces was met like a lead balloon in a lot of quarters. And it was like, you're joking, right? You're joking. And people wanted to go back to the way it was, So I mean, good on Harry Truman, but it really is a sign of the times back in those days. All right. Well, this is where we started. 1948. When I talk about World War One, World War One left the Ottoman Empire had collapsed because of World War One. And that was an awful lot of territory, and there was a power vacuum, and a power vacuum can't remain a vacuum. And the Treaty of Versailles gave I don't know, a quasi-reluctant Great Britain the authority to administrate the entire area that was the former Ottoman Empire, right? And you had two states at least that were created as a result of all this out of nowhere by Westerners, one Iraq and one Transjordan. And the British were administering the area known as Palestine on the Eastern Mediterranean, where Israel is now, and where Gaza is now, and where the West Bank is now, and Lebanon, and all the rest of that. So what happens here is a very unique period of time. I mean, it's a small window. a very small window. You have the newly created United Nations, right? Which had tremendous promise, right? Because the United Nations was going to, I guess the word would be replace the ineffectual League of Nations, right? See, the League of Nations after World War I was put into place to prevent a catastrophe that was World War I from happening ever again, right? So, but the League of Nations had a lot of flaws in it, right? Which I can go into on another day. All right. When we do the legacy of Woodrow Wilson, I think that that would be, that would cover that, but here in this region, you had Jews who wanted to emigrate to what they referred to as Israel. And then that was met, of course, with a lot of resentment by Arab peoples in the regions, right, which were referred to in this particular case as Palestinians. And the thing is that, well, could you coexist? Could you not coexist? And there was a lot of, I mean, in 1939 New York World's Fair, there was an Israel, there was a Jewish-Palestinian joint exhibition, and we're going to live in peace and we're going to turn the desert into an oasis, right? So you had the Jews who kept wanting to emigrate there because it's in the Bible. It's in the Bible. So if you're a literalist, whether you're a Christian or a Jew, and you're a literalist, right? A biblical literalist, then what do you, it's right here. God says that this is your homeland right here. And so that's like legitimate enough under that criteria, right? But there's a lot of resentment going on, of course, with these Jews being there. And it was always a millstone around the neck of the British. I mean, the British were always trying to appease the Arabs, and they were always trying to, not anger the Jews and all the rest of that. I have a good story called Exodus 1947, and it's about this ragtag bunch of renegade ships that were used by refugee organizations immediately after World War II to essentially, I guess the word would be smuggle Jews into what they perceived to be their homeland, right? And the particular specific period of time, of course, is like immediately after the Holocaust. Immediately after the Holocaust, where you have Jews by the thousands who have no place to go, who are Holocaust survivors in new camps in Germany that are now being administrated in the occupied territories. And from a political standpoint, the American the Americans had sympathy kind of towards the Jews, right? And I think even the French maybe, but the British had the direct handle on the political consequences of the Jews being snuck out and then winding up in Palestine because the British were the ones who had to deal with the outrage over it, you see. So that's a whole nother story. But the thing here is that the United Nations, the newly formed United Nations, decides to grant Israel its sovereignty in the form of a two-state solution, right? So that could be, of course, another six-part series on even today's politics. Okay. And then certainly going to be part of our life now. Two-state solution versus that's obsolete. Right? Is a big part of our current politics. And if you're of one point of view or the other point of view, or if you think that Israel is a settler colonialist state and is funded by the equally colonial oppressor state, the United States, you say, big Satan, little Satan, right? All topics for other discussions. But right here, Israel declares its independence, right? Which was the equivalent, by the way, of the United States in 1776 publishing the Declaration of Independence, right? So the whole thing is whether or not, well, I mean, it's one thing, and we got to hand it to you. It was ballsy for you to declare your independence. Now, are you going to wither on the vine? Or is there going to be some countries, important countries, that are going to recognize you as a sovereign state and give you legitimacy and support? And Israel would have withered on the vine, I think, had it not been for one politician in particular who acted in defiance of the advice of his chief counsel, his Secretary of State, one George Marshall, the George Marshall. And George Marshall told Harry Truman, don't do it. Don't do it. This is going to be quicksand for the United States forever. It's going to be political quicksand for you personally. Harry Truman went around and says, thanks for your advice. And he turned around and he recognized the state of Israel. Right. So there's a lot of ideas about why he might have done that. Depends on who you read or where you listen to, and it's like, well, he did it for the Jewish vote. He did it for this. Everybody's a cynical politician. One of the things that we in our secularized world we don't really understand is people who actually take their biblical um credibility seriously is like there are people, and this gets kind of mocked among us that are considers ourselves to be intellectuals or educated or somehow sophisticated, that any notion of biblical authenticity of the truth is, well, you believe in fairy tales, you see. But Harry Truman, as I said to you earlier, was a biblical literalist, and the if you he couldn't be a Christian. Harry Truman couldn't be a Christian without recognizing that God gave the Jews the land of Israel. It's in the Bible. For Harry Truman, you could not believe in the New Testament if you didn't believe in its basis in the Old Testament. Now, it's true that the New Covenant and the Old Covenant are different in many regards, but that's what Harry Truman felt, and he acted on it. And yeah, I think that George Marshall actually was right. This has been now a millstone around, and the United States has been associated with Zionism because I think it's pretty clear that without the United States, the state of Israel never would have survived. Certainly not in those early days, and certainly not throughout, as I mentioned to you earlier, my entire life without the United States. So there you have it. This could be a five-part series by itself. You know that. But the state of Israel was a big one. That's David Ben-Gurion. Three people told me who this guy was. I keep forgetting it. I'll have to apologize. That's the menorah. Pretty nice. So anyway, it's one thing for having Franklin Delano Roosevelt fall over one day and be dead, and now you're the president, right? The notion that Harry Truman could run for office and actually be elected president on his own right. I mean, well, that's laughable. I mean, get out of here. Go back to Missouri, you know. And but he runs. I don't know. If I was Harry Truman, this is a great picture. I love this photograph. This is the greatest political photograph of all time. And if I was Harry Truman, I'd be laughing my ass off too. There it is, right? Anyway, so there's our Harry Truman. I got a couple of quotes for you. There's this called the Summer White House, right? Which was down in Key West, I guess. You can see that this is now 1951. The Price of Life magazine has skyrocketed to the astronomical price of 20 cents a copy. And that is what I guess we affectionately refer to as a Hawaii shirt, right? So we have the famous story with Harry Truman and Douglas MacArthur. And this story here is an important one because of the contrast of Harry Truman and somebody like Douglas MacArthur. And where is the contrast from? It's from the perception of the press and our need to put certain types of people on pedestals. I mean, MacArthur hadn't been back to the United States. This photograph is taken in what, 1951, I guess. And Korean War, they're meeting in Guam, I think. It was either Guam or Wake. But Harry Truman had to fly all the way over to the Pacific to meet the very busy Douglas MacArthur, who has taken time out of his schedule of running the post-war Pacific, right? And now running the Korean War. And he's meeting with Harry Truman. And Harry Truman, right or wrong, Harry Truman is the president of the United States. And his position and his administration's position is that we need to keep the Korean War limited to the Korean Peninsula. Okay? We're in a world now that's completely different than it used to be, only a few years earlier. This is not World War II anymore. Since the end of World War II, not only does the United States have a nuclear stockpile, but since 1949, 2 years preceding this photograph, the Russians now are building their own stockpile. And it was the Russians who greenlighted the North Koreans to invade South Korea. Okay. In this period of time also, all of China has gone communist, right? Chairman Mao has won the revolution. Chiang Kai-shek, Douglas MacArthur's, who he worked with during World War II in the Pacific as our allies in China. The entire Chinese nationalist movement and army under Chiang Kai-shek, having now lost to Chairman Mao's communists, they actually were driven offshore on the island of Formosa, aka Taiwan. Here's another gem that has never gone away, right? We've always been supportive of what ostensibly is I don't know, an anti-communist Taiwan, right? And this is where that starts. You see, it's always Douglas MacArthur's fantasy that he is going to restore order if given the opportunity in the Pacific. And what that means is that if we have to, we'll use nuclear weapons to go to war with the Chinese so we can actually eliminate the Chinese communists once and for all and actually restore the Chinese nationalists back into power in China. And that's what the world needs. And who do you think Douglas MacArthur holds responsible for the loss of China to communism? Douglas MacArthur blames Harry Truman. And so do a lot of other people, by the way. So Douglas MacArthur during the Korean War is pushing past the United Nations mandate to drive the communists back over the 38th parallel. By the way, the only reason why the United States was able to pull together a coalition vis-a-vis the United Nations Security Council, right? The Security Council was something put into the United Nations that the League of Nations didn't have because the League of Nations had no teeth to actually do something if somebody violated an international boundary, you see, right? So what happened here was the United States never recognized communist China. And the Russians took that as a personal insult because it was a slight against communism. It was prejudicial against communism, which it was. You see, so the Russians, in protest of the United States not recognizing Maoist China as a sovereign government, a new sovereign government, the Russians walked out of the United Nations, right? And during that period of time that they weren't there, that's when the invasion from North Korea into South Korea occurred in 1950. And the United Nations was convened, and the Security Council met and was authorized to put a coalition force together, the first time that type of term was used, to actually drive a legitimate aggressor back from whence they came. Now, the Russia is a sovereign member, a permanent member of the Security Council, and every one of them has veto power. Okay, so the thing is that the only reasons the Russians didn't veto our intervention in Korea, military intervention, is because the Russians weren't there, because they were boycotting it because we refused to recognize Maoist China. So now you have this massive conflict in visions here. You see, so MacArthur is he's like a god. You know, uh, he went over to the Pacific in 1937 or something, and on behest of Roosevelt to prepare the Filipino guerrillas. Okay, remember that Philippines is still flying under the American flag as a protectorate archipelago group of islands since the Spanish-American War. Okay, 1898. And then of course, I mean, if you were to ask Douglas MacArthur, or he would have told you that he was responsible for winning World War II himself. I mean, all of these guys, I'm not knocking him. They all had some pretty big egos, and and after that, the guy was like literally running his own country. He was in charge of Japan from 1945 right up to this point, where he's asked to be pulled in. He's the obvious person to pull in to run the Korean War and be the leader of the coalition forces, the United Nations coalition forces. So the American people saw him as this kind of like larger than life, you know, demigod. And here's once again, the diminutive Harry Truman. What the hell does he know? He wouldn't even been president. And, the whole thing's just a weird mistake, fluke, you see? So Harry Truman tells MacArthur that he needs to chill out a little bit because MacArthur is actually provoking the Chinese at the north part of Korea, northern Korea, North Korea, at the border of China, which is at the Yalu River. And there's all kinds of intelligence and all kinds of stuff coming in that the Chinese have amassed hundreds and hundreds of thousands of troops, right, poised to pour into North Korea. And Douglas MacArthur is basically like, well, we'll deal with that if it happens, And so the point was that Douglas MacArthur's goal was strategically in opposition to Harry Truman, the President of the United States goal, right? Douglas MacArthur would welcome the intervention of Chinese military, because then we'd be at war with the Chinese. Which is, by the way, what happened, even though we weren't directly at war with the Chinese. This is one of these weird euphemisms. It's kind of like, well, we don't have any troops in the ground anywhere. We're not at war anywhere. Meanwhile, you got people, all kinds of people on ships and airplanes and all over the place, on the ground, on ships and flying in the air that are getting paid combat pay because they're getting shot at or shooting at somebody else. But we're not in a war, you see? So I'll leave that to you. Right. So this is really the first modern war that we still find ourselves in this new lexicon of like weird terminology in the Korean War. And so we're fighting the Chinese directly now. Douglas MacArthur would be happy to turn it into a general conflict with the Chinese and then use nuclear weapons if we have to for the aforementioned stated reasons, right? To recover China, right, from the communists. And this is in direct opposition to what the United Nations Security Council's resolution says we're authorized to do, and his boss, by the way, Harry Truman's stated foreign policy. Now, MacArthur goes and remember, he's running his own country, Japan, and he's got his own press corps, he's got his own people, and not only that, but he's being courted by the Republicans to be the next Republican president because people can't wait to get rid of the damn Democrats. They've been in power since 1933. And that's another thing that's making MacArthur even more cocky than he already was. So MacArthur lets go with this editorial reporting, right, via his sources and his power in the newspapers. Highly critical of the Truman administration foreign policy. And that's enough for Harry Truman now. Harry Truman fires him for insubordination, which it was. And Douglas MacArthur wraps it up. They handed it over to Matthew Ridgway. MacArthur comes back as this conquering hero, ticker tape parade, soppy speech in front of Congress, West Point, all the rest of that. It is still the go-to situation, right? You hear threads of this through modern politics if you know what you're looking at. And people, this is the lodestone of literally this story. It's a nice picture of Beth. You know, I took some time to tell you some stories and put a few things in context. I had some quotes. The quotes are going to have to wait. Incredibly, it is like 3 o'clock. And what a seminal period of history. What an absolute seminal period of history. Harry Truman has to deal with the rise of the Berlin, not the Berlin Wall, rather, but he has to deal with the communism and the buffer states, right? The Iron Curtain. He has to there's something called the Truman Doctrine, which basically says this is when 1947, Harry Truman commits the United States indefinitely to supporting any people who is struggling for its own survival against outside forces, right, who have sort of like infiltrated their government to flip the government. In other words, the Russians. And that carried us through it certainly was our intervention in Vietnam, et cetera, and elsewhere. Um, it was a big commitment. It was a big commitment. This is the time. This is the 1950s. This is the time of McCarthyism. I'm not saying that it was an overreaction or whatever it was. I'll give you one example of this. What spurred that was that in 1947, Great Britain was like, they're still pulling back their garrison forces. It's 1947 is still immediately post after World War II, And what happens here is that the British tell us, the United States, that the British are going to be removing their garrison forces that they had in place in Turkey and Greece. Okay. And well, if the United States doesn't immediately fill that void with either military support of those two nations or with our own garrison force to replace it, the vacuum that will be left from the British leaving, the vacuum of power will be filled immediately by the Russians. And there'll be two more states behind that'll be part of what we came to know as the Warsaw Pact, right? Or behind the Iron Curtain. And that's when Harry Truman created the Truman Doctrine, or was what's known as the Truman Doctrine. that we are going to support them. We are going to give them stuff. We are going to give them material, anything it's going to take to actually slow down, inhibit, resist worldwide communism. And because the purpose of communism, as Lenin said, was to establish global socialism. All right. And that was the period of time that literally created our world and then we had the fall of the Berlin Wall and the Soviet Union in 1989, 1990, 1991. And then it became the era of post. We had 10 years until we were in the age of terror. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you for joining me. I could have done this for another hour and a half easy. It's a privilege for me to spend time with you and for you to have signed up in my class. I'd rather be doing this with you than practically anything. All right, so it's 3 o'clock. And if anybody needs any information from me, you can email me at agott@optonline.net. Um, God bless all of you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
You're quite welcome. All right,
Thank you.
folks. See you next time.
Thank you.